Imagine a time long, long ago, even before there were cars or telephones. This is the time of ancient Rome, a powerful place filled with emperors, soldiers, and grand buildings. In this world lived a young boy named Sporus. Sporus wasn't famous for being strong or brave like a soldier. He was known for something else, his incredible beauty. People would stop and stare when he walked by. He had bright eyes, soft skin, and hair that shone in the sun. He was like a living statue, perfect in every way. Now, in our time, being beautiful might mean being a movie star or a singer. But back then, in ancient Rome, beauty could be both a blessing and a curse. It could bring you attention and gifts, but it could also put you in danger. Sporus was just a young boy, probably around the same age as some of you. He didn't ask to be so beautiful, but it was something he couldn't change. And because of his beauty, his life would take a very strange and sad turn, involving one of Rome's most famous and strangest emperors, Nero. We'll learn more about Nero soon, but remember that he wasn't like other emperors. He was known for doing things that seemed very odd and sometimes even cruel. So who was Sporus? He was a young boy, blessed or perhaps cursed, with extraordinary beauty, living in a time of powerful emperors and strange customs. His story is one that has been told for many years, a story of beauty, power, and sadness. Get ready to learn about his journey and how his life became tangled with the life of the Emperor Nero. Now let's talk about Nero. Imagine the most powerful person in the world, someone who could do almost anything they wanted. That was Nero. He was the Emperor of Rome, which meant he was in charge of a huge empire filled with people and riches. But being an emperor didn't always make him wise or good. Nero was known for being a bit unusual. He loved music and poetry, which wasn't a bad thing, but he sometimes thought he was the best singer and actor in the world, even if others didn't agree. He would hold contests and force people to listen to him for hours. He also did things that were considered very strange and even wrong. He spent lots of money on parties and building grand palaces, while many people in Rome were poor. He made decisions that didn't make sense to others, and he often didn't listen to the advice of his advisors. Some people even thought Nero was cruel. There were rumors that he was responsible for terrible things happening in Rome, though it's hard to know for sure what really happened so long ago. But one thing is certain, Nero was not your average emperor. He lived in a world of his own making, where rules didn't always apply and where his own desires came first. This Nero's crazy world, as we'll call it, is important to understand because it's where Sporus' story takes a very strange turn. Imagine being a young boy, known for your beauty, and then being pulled into the world of someone as powerful and unpredictable as Nero. It was like stepping into a dream, or maybe a nightmare. So how did Nero and Sporus meet? It's hard to know exactly, because stories from that time are often mixed with rumors and legends. But we can imagine a scene. Perhaps Sporus was working as a servant in a wealthy household, or maybe he was simply walking through the marketplace. News of Sporus's beauty had probably spread throughout Rome. People talked, and whispers reached the emperor's ears. Nero, always looking for something new and exciting, likely wanted to see this beautiful boy for himself. Perhaps Nero arranged for Sporus to be brought to the palace. Or maybe he saw him during a public event. However it happened, the moment Nero saw Sporus, he was captivated. It wasn't just a simple admiration. It was something much stronger, almost like an obsession. Imagine Nero, used to being obeyed and surrounded by luxury, suddenly struck by the sight of this young boy. Sporus's beauty was unlike anything he had ever seen. Nero was used to people flattering him and trying to please him, but Sporus was different. He possessed a natural beauty that couldn't be bought or faked. Some might say it was love at first sight, but it was more likely an intense fascination. Nero was drawn to Sporus's beauty in a way that was both powerful and unsettling. He saw in Sporus something he wanted to possess, something that made him feel powerful and in control. This fascination would change both of their lives forever, setting in motion a series of events that were both shocking and tragic. The meeting of Nero and Sporus was the spark that ignited a very strange and sad chapter in Roman history. Now, before Nero's obsession with Sporus could fully take hold, something else happened that changed everything. Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, died. Poppaea was a beautiful and powerful woman, and Nero was very fond of her. Her death was a great shock to him. He was heartbroken and overwhelmed with grief. Losing someone you love is always hard, and for Nero, who was already a bit unstable, it was especially devastating. Some stories say Poppaea died from illness, while others whisper that Nero himself was responsible, perhaps in a fit of anger. We may never know the truth, but what's important is that her death left a huge hole in Nero's life. Grief can make people do strange things. It can cloud their judgment and make them act in ways they normally wouldn't. Nero's grief was so intense that it seemed to push him over the edge. He became even more erratic and unpredictable. He mourned Poppaea with lavish ceremonies and built monuments in her honor. But beneath the surface, his mind was unraveling. He was lost in a world of sorrow and confusion, and he desperately needed something to fill the void left by Poppaea's death. It was in this state of grief and near madness that Nero began to see something in Sporus that would forever change the young boy's life. He started to believe that Sporus looked remarkably like Poppaea. This wasn't just a passing thought. It became an obsession that would lead to the most shocking and unbelievable part of Sporus' story. The death of Poppaea was the catalyst, the event that set Nero on a path that defied all reason and decency. Driven by his grief and obsession, Nero made a decision that was shocking even by the standards of ancient Rome. He became convinced that Sporus looked so much like Poppaea that he decided to make Sporus more like her. This is where the story becomes very difficult to tell, and we need to be careful with our words. Nero wanted Sporus to be as much like a woman as possible. To do this, he ordered something terrible to be done to Sporus. In those times, there was a procedure called castration. This meant that a boy would be changed in a way that he could no longer have children and would develop more feminine features. It was a painful and dangerous thing to do, and it took away a person's ability to have a normal life. Nero forced Sporus to undergo this procedure. It's important to understand that Sporus had no choice in this. He was a young boy in the power of a very powerful and unstable emperor. He couldn't say no. This act was not only cruel but also showed how far Nero had gone in his madness. He wasn't just grieving for his wife. He was trying to recreate her, to control someone and force them to be something they weren't. This is a very sad and difficult part of the story, and it's important to remember that Sporus was a victim in all of this. He was a young boy who had his life changed forever by the actions of a powerful and cruel man. This act would forever bind Sporus to Nero's twisted desires. After the terrible act that Nero forced upon him, Sporus' life changed completely. He was no longer allowed to be himself. Nero insisted that Sporus dress in the beautiful gowns and jewelry that had belonged to Poppaea. He had to style his hair like her and even try to act like her. Imagine being forced to pretend to be someone else, someone who is no longer alive. It must have been incredibly confusing and painful for Sporus. He was trapped in a role he never asked for, a living doll in Nero's twisted fantasy. Sporus became Nero's constant companion. He went everywhere with the emperor, attending banquets, watching performances, and even participating in religious ceremonies. Nero treated Sporus as if he were Poppaea, showering him with affection and attention. But it was all based on a lie, a distorted image of the woman he had lost. Sporus had no friends, no freedom, and no real life of his own. He was simply a reflection of Nero's grief and madness. He was a prisoner in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but deprived of any true happiness or autonomy. This situation must have been incredibly isolating for Sporus. He was surrounded by people, but he was completely alone, forced to play a role that was both demeaning and heartbreaking. He was a symbol of Nero's power and his inability to cope with loss, a constant reminder of the emperor's descent into madness. His days were filled with pretending, and his nights were likely filled with fear and sorrow. The young boy was completely lost within Nero's world. Nero's behavior with Sporus did not go unnoticed. In fact, it caused a huge scandal in Rome. Even in a time when emperors could do almost anything they wanted, Nero's actions were considered shocking and outrageous. People whispered behind their hands, gossiping about the strange relationship between the emperor and the young boy dressed as a woman. They couldn't believe that Nero, the ruler of the Roman Empire, was behaving in such a bizarre and disrespectful way. Imagine the scene: Nero and Sporus arriving at a public event, Sporus dressed in Papia's clothes, looking uncomfortable and out of place. People would stare, point, and whisper, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and fear. It wasn't just the common people who were scandalized. Even the senators and other powerful officials in Rome were appalled by Nero's behavior. They worried that his madness was making the empire look weak and foolish. They feared what he might do next. Roman society had certain rules and expectations, even for emperors. Nero was breaking all of those rules. His obsession with Sporus was seen as a sign of his growing instability and a threat to the stability of the entire empire. The scandal surrounding Nero and Sporus created a climate of fear and uncertainty in Rome. People were afraid to speak out against the emperor, but they also knew that something was terribly wrong. The whispers and rumors grew louder, creating a sense of unease that permeated every level of Roman society. Nero's actions had not only destroyed Sporus's life, but were also shaking the foundations of the Roman Empire. As if the whispers and scandal weren't enough, Nero decided to take things even further. In a move that shocked Rome to its core, he held a public wedding ceremony and married Sporus. Imagine the scene: a grand procession, with musicians playing and crowds lining the streets. Nero, dressed in his finest robes, stood beside Sporus, who was also dressed in bridal attire. It was a spectacle that defied all Roman traditions and customs. This wasn't a real marriage, of course. It was a mock wedding, a theatrical performance designed to satisfy Nero's twisted desires. But it was also a public declaration of his relationship with Sporus, a blatant disregard for the opinions of his people and the authority of the Roman state. The ceremony was met with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Some people were simply shocked into silence, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Others whispered and pointed, their faces contorted with disgust and outrage. Even Nero's supporters were taken aback by this brazen display of madness. They knew that this act would further damage his reputation and weaken his hold on power. The mock wedding was the final straw, the event that convinced many people that Nero had completely lost his mind. For Sporus, the wedding must have been a nightmare. Forced to participate in this bizarre charade, he was further humiliated and stripped of his dignity. He was a pawn in Nero's game, a symbol of the emperor's complete and utter disregard for the feelings of others. The mock wedding was a public declaration of Sporus's captivity. The mock wedding was the beginning of the end for Nero. His strange behavior and disregard for the needs of the Roman people had finally caught up with him. People were tired of his extravagant spending, his cruel decisions, and his increasingly bizarre actions. Rebellions started to break out in different parts of the empire. Roman soldiers, who were supposed to be loyal to Nero, began to turn against him. The senators, who had long been critical of his rule, saw an opportunity to seize power. Nero's world began to crumble around him. He lost the support of his friends, his advisors, and even his own guards. He realized that he was in grave danger. Faced with the prospect of being captured and killed, Nero decided to flee Rome. He disguised himself and, along with a few loyal servants, escaped into the countryside. He was no longer the powerful emperor of Rome. He was a fugitive, running for his life. It must have been a terrifying experience for Nero. He had always been surrounded by luxury and power, and now he was alone and vulnerable. He knew that his enemies were closing in and that his time was running out. Even in this moment of crisis, Nero didn't seem to fully grasp the consequences of his actions. He continued to indulge in his fantasies, imagining himself as a great artist and lamenting the loss of his power. He was a broken and delusional man, clinging to the last vestiges of his former glory. The world he created for himself had finally collapsed. Nero knew that his enemies were closing in. He was trapped, and there was no escape. Rather than face capture and a humiliating death at the hands of his enemies, Nero chose to end his own life. It was a sad and tragic end for a man who had once been the most powerful person in the world. He died a broken and defeated man, far from the glory and luxury he had once enjoyed. With Nero's death, Sporus's life changed once again. The chains that had bound him to Nero were finally broken. He was no longer forced to pretend to be Poppaea, no longer subjected to Nero's twisted desires. But Nero's death didn't magically erase the past. Sporus was still a young person who had been through terrible experiences. He had been robbed of his freedom, his identity, and his innocence. He was still living with the consequences of Nero's actions. The world that Sporus knew had been completely upended. He was no longer in the palace, surrounded by luxury and power. He was now adrift in a world that was uncertain and dangerous. While Nero's death offered Sporus a chance at a new beginning, it also presented him with new challenges. He had to find a way to rebuild his life, to heal from the trauma he had endured, and to forge his own identity after years of being forced to be someone else. The end of Nero's reign was not necessarily the end of Sporus's suffering. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty and the daunting task of reclaiming his life. Sadly, Nero's death didn't bring Sporus the freedom he deserved. In the chaotic power struggles that followed Nero's downfall, another emperor, Otho, rose to power. And Otho, like Nero, was captivated by Sporus's beauty. Otho had known of Sporus and the scandal with Nero. He saw Sporus not as a person, but as a prize, a symbol of power and luxury. He wanted to possess Sporus, to have him as part of his own court. So Otho took Sporus into his care. This wasn't an act of kindness or compassion. It was another act of control, another attempt to use Sporus for his own selfish purposes. Sporus went from being Nero's wife to being a possession of Otho. Imagine how Sporus must have felt. He had just escaped from one terrible situation, only to find himself in another. He had hoped for freedom, but instead, he was once again trapped in a world of power and manipulation. He had no say in his own destiny. He was simply a pawn in the games of emperors, his life controlled by the whims of powerful men. The hope of reclaiming his life was quickly fading. It must have felt like he was cursed, doomed to be forever at the mercy of cruel and selfish rulers. His beauty, which had once seemed like a blessing, had become his curse, attracting the attention of men who saw him as nothing more than an object to be possessed. The cycle of abuse continued. Sporus's story has a very sad ending. He had endured so much pain and suffering. He had been robbed of his freedom, his identity, and his dignity. He had been used and abused by powerful men who saw him as nothing more than an object. When Otho took him, Sporus knew that he couldn't bear to live another moment in that kind of captivity. He had reached his breaking point. He refused to be a pawn in Otho's games, refused to be subjected to another emperor's twisted desires. Instead of submitting to Otho's will, Sporus chose to end his own life. It was a tragic decision, but it was also an act of defiance. It was the only way he could reclaim control over his own destiny, the only way he could escape the endless cycle of abuse and exploitation. We don't know exactly how Sporus died, but we know that he chose death over a life of continued suffering. It was a desperate act, born out of despair and a longing for peace. His death is a reminder of the terrible power that emperors held in ancient Rome and the devastating consequences that their actions could have on the lives of ordinary people. It is a story of beauty, power, and ultimately tragic loss. Sporus's life, though short and filled with sorrow, serves as a testament to the human spirit's yearning for freedom and dignity, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. His choice, though heartbreaking, was his final act of resistance. Sporus's story is a difficult one to hear, but it's important that we remember it. We remember it not because it's a happy story, but because it teaches us about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. The story of Sporus shows us just how strange and powerful Roman emperors could be. They had the power to do almost anything they wanted, even things that were cruel and unjust. Sporus's life was completely controlled by Nero and Otho, who saw him as nothing more than a possession. But more than that, Sporus's story is a sad tale about someone who didn't have much choice in his own life. He was born with great beauty, but that beauty became a curse, attracting the attention of men who wanted to control him. He was forced to endure terrible things, and ultimately he was driven to take his own life. Remembering Sporus reminds us that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and compassion. It reminds us that power should be used wisely and justly, and that we should always stand up for those who are being mistreated. His story also reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can still yearn for freedom and dignity. Sporus's final act, his decision to end his own life, was a desperate attempt to reclaim control over his own destiny. By remembering Sporus, we honor his memory and we learn valuable lessons about the importance of empathy, justice, and the enduring power of the human spirit. His story serves as a warning against the abuse of power and a call for compassion for those who are vulnerable. Let us never forget Sporus.